We'll get started. Okay.
Okay.
Hello. This presentation is titled The Importance of Estate Planning Early and Often. We're going to cover basic estate planning concepts that are important to consider and also why it needs to be an ongoing part of a financial planning and review process. I'm Dana Vosberg, Managing Director of Advisory Services, and I'm joined by my colleague, Veronica Van Nest, a Senior Wealth Management Consultant on our Advisory Services team, as well as a Trust Officer for Exeter Trust Company, our affiliated trust company. And thanks, Veronica, for joining me for this presentation.
Yep, happy to do it.
All right, so when people hear the term estate planning, a number of things probably come to mind, and many are not necessarily not always positive. For one, it forces people to confront their mortality, as in, when I'm gone, here's what I'd like to happen. And that's, sometimes that can be just a strange thought process for some people. And it can be difficult also just because it might force people to confront or address difficult family situations. Certain family members may be less responsible with money, or there may be strained relationships. So that can create a real challenge. Finally, let's face it, life is really busy, and planning for events after life isn't a big priority for most of us. So there are, so these are just a few of the common reasons for why people may delay estate planning or avoid it altogether. And our goal in this video is really to outline estate planning basics and highlight reasons why delaying estate planning can be costly or problematic, particularly now when you think about some of the proposals that are floating around and things that you may be seeing in the news. So therefore, it's important to establish an estate plan early and really make an effort to review it on a regular basis as part of your overall plan. So now to touch on some of perhaps the common misconceptions about estate planning, estate planning in general isn't just for ultra rich people. It's not something for multimillionaires only with complex plans and multiple trusts that distribute a massive estate over time. It's important for people who wouldn't consider themselves to be rich at all. And estate planning isn't just for older people trying to tie up loose ends and getting their affairs in order. It's important for much younger generations to establish a plan also. So estate planning represents a key piece of the financial planning puzzle, and really should be evaluated in all stages of life. And that's saving, investing, retirement planning, tax planning, insurance. All of those areas can impact estate planning. And without estate planning, all of the hard work that went into building an organized plan and an organized estate at any level, those efforts to be financially responsible during your lifetime can be heavily impacted. So I like to sum it up by saying that the simple goal is to avoid really leaving a mess for your family. That's kind of, I think, a simple way of thinking about what is estate planning for most people. Otherwise, finances may not be in order, and people may be unintentionally disinherited, and it can be hard to know someone's intentions if the plan isn't outlined, and during a time that is likely very challenging for a family as they deal with the loss of a loved one. So that's why it's important to review estate planning documents regularly and work with an attorney to implement changes that will keep you on track to achieving your multi-generational goals. And so with that, let's first cover some important estate planning concepts that can really set the stage for topics we'll discuss a little bit later on in this video, and also touch on the current status of estate tax laws. So I'll turn it over, Veronica, to you on this part.
Great. So, to Dana's point, a lot of the documents we're going to talk about are important for individuals at any age. The most important document, I think, in anybody's estate plan, and I've spoken to clients, I've told clients, even if you don't have a will, a revocable trust, is a durable power of attorney, because that durable power of attorney allows an individual you name to handle your finances if you can't do that while you're alive. It does expire at death, but it's a very important document, because if something were to happen to you, you're in an accident, you're in a coma, you're out of the country, you need money, nobody can access your accounts unless they have a durable power of attorney. It's extremely important for IRA accounts. Nobody, some account, like your taxable accounts might be joint, you might have somebody as a signer, but IRA accounts are an individual account. No one can access those accounts without a durable power of attorney. So it's very important. That is the crucial piece. If somebody doesn't have a will, at least if they have that power of attorney that will allow for management of assets while you're alive, which is very important. Going hand in hand kind of with while you're alive, the revocable trusts are also a nice vehicle to have. The revocable trust, you would basically have a trust into which you transfer your assets while you're alive. You manage the assets while you're alive. After your death, there's an easy transition of assets to the next generation. There's no probate involved. These are very nice documents for if you have property in multiple states, so you don't have to probate your estate in multiple states. They're nice if you have family members who you might want to disinherit, or you don't have family members, you don't have children, you might not have siblings, and you want to leave things to your to friends. It is a document that's not subject to the probate laws and is also gives some privacy protection to you because it's not something that has to be filed with the courts, so that you're able to keep private what your intentions are. So those are two real important documents to have while you're alive. And then I think on the next slide, we're talking about, after you pass away, the documents that kind of govern how things are distributed. So last will and testament, so that document determines how your assets are going to be passed. It only distributes assets that are not payable to a named beneficiary or jointly held. So it's very important to keep that in mind. Usually with the will, you name an executor to handle your estate. You want that person to be responsible with money and also be able to understand what they need to do to handle your estate. They work very closely with an attorney generally who can provide them guidance, but you want that person to be somewhat savvy. You can also name a trustee, and the same requirements would apply. A guardian for your children. In my experience, when I was in private practice, this was the reason that a lot of people didn't create a will, because they were, the couple couldn't agree on really who was going to be the guardian for the children. But that's very important. And at least in most states, and definitely in New York, which is where I've generally practiced, if you don't name somebody, the court will decide. So you need to kind of decide if you want to say in who's going to be the guardian for your children. You need to take care of that in your will. The other item is beneficiary designations and transfer on death arrangements. Many years ago, there was different statutes passed which allowed you to name a beneficiary on your investment accounts. Generally, before that, you only saw beneficiary designations on IRAs and life insurance, and now that has changed. The one caution with these arrangements is that you need to be very careful not to have everything go by beneficiary designation or transfer on death arrangement, because some assets need to be retained in the estate in order to handle estate expenses when somebody passes away, pay any bequests that are under the will. So while beneficiary designations and transfer on death arrangements, sometimes people think, oh, that's going to take the place of my will. You really need to kind of, you need to be careful about how you name those designations. And then the last is irrevocable trusts. And those are established by individuals. A lot of times we see these for estate tax planning. One of the most common ones are the irrevocable life insurance trusts, what we like to call ILITs. And those are where an individual creates a trust that holds life insurance. When they die, the trustee collects the life insurance and pays it to the beneficiaries under the terms of the trust. A lot of people use these types of trusts as a wealth replacement vehicle if they need to pay estate taxes, or just to leave an extra amount of money to their children. So, we see a lot of these documents in conjunction with each other, and the one caution is to make sure that they all do work in conjunction with each other, that those beneficiary designations are in line with the will, and everything kind of will work together. And then we have the estate tax. So we've there's been a lot of discussion lately about the estate taxes, and you know, there's legislation out there, some proposed legislation to bring these limits down. Currently, the estate tax the federal estate tax limit is 11.7 per person, and that is the law in 2021. Spouses may share the exclusion. So if one spouse doesn't have enough to use all the exclusion, the spouse can use what they couldn't use in their own. And then any amount over and above the exclusion is taxed at 40%. There's also some state estate taxes, New York being one of them. We have 12 states and the District of Columbia still have an estate tax. 6 states have an inheritance tax. And if you live in Maryland, you're lucky to have both. So there's been a lot of talk and, you know, about changes to this, but this is the current estate tax law. The federal estate tax is scheduled to sunset at the end of 2025, so that in 2026, the figure would be probably close to $6 million. It's $5 million adjusted for inflation over a long period of time. So the general consensus is it might start at $6 million at that point. Unless it's changed before that. And then we, you know, there's some estate tax considerations that you can think about. You know, very few, with the exclusion being so high, very few people are truly impacted with the estate tax. And, you know, some of our older plans were created at a time when the estate tax was much lower. When I started practicing, I think it was under $1 million, you know, so it's definitely jumped quite a bit in about the 20 years I've been doing this. So it, you know, some estate plans that were older, created at a time when maybe the exemption was a couple million or so, might have these trusts that are no longer necessary. So it is important, as Dana said earlier, you know, to update those plans over time and, you know, meet with your attorney, talk about the new estate tax laws and whether changes should be made. You might simplify your will greatly by doing that. And then going forward, some of the proposals that have been introduced are more income tax and capital gains tax focused. There's talk about a potential a potential step up in basis not being there anymore upon death. Usually when an individual dies, their estate receives the value of the assets as of the date of death, and that leads to very little income tax being paid by the beneficiaries. So this would be a significant change to the way things are done now and could result in very expensive tax bills for beneficiaries. And one of the things, you know, we're talking to clients about is, you know, doing some gifting now to kind of get ahead of that if we see that on the horizon. And also if, you know, clients are in states where the estate tax is still an impact, they need to consider doing some planning around that as well.
Right, and Veronica, it's it's interesting right now, or I guess the progression of things for estate planning and estate tax planning, where, as you touched on it, you know, it's progressed to the point where fewer and fewer people are really impacted by estate tax. You know, there was a time, as you mentioned before, when the exemption was so much lower, where if you just had a retirement account and a house, you know, potentially even then you're at a point where, based on where values were and how things can appreciate over time, you know, somebody who wasn't really wealthy at all would be exposed to, or they certainly wouldn't feel that way, they'd be exposed to estate tax. And so, but then over time, it's gotten to the point where it really has limited the number of people that are truly impacted based on how high the exemption is. And so I think with, you know, some of the proposals that are out there, just the interesting thing to pay attention to will be, if those levels are brought down to a point where you have so many more people impacted again, and while estate planning is important just for the general purpose of, as I mentioned before, just making sure your affairs are in order and you pass on an estate that you have orderly to your family and loved ones, then the tax part of that, the tax planning part of that's going to suddenly become that much more important. So.
Yeah, it will be. It's just, I think with the estate tax, the estate tax is an easy one to hit, but I just think that money needs to be made somewhere, and income taxes are generally an easy way to do that.
Right. Okay. So moving on then, let's discuss the importance of planning throughout someone's lifetime. And as I mentioned earlier, estate planning is a vital part of the financial planning process in all stages of life. And some stages might require more complex planning than others, but really each is going to have very important issues that need to be addressed. So if you set up a plan early, a lot can change in the following years. Assets change, family situations change, goals change. So a plan that was good at one time might not be as effective 10, 20, or certainly 30 years down the line, particularly when you're thinking about again, some of the tax changes that we're talking about. So we've broken this discussion down into 3 basic stages of life represented by generations that I think we're all pretty familiar with. And, one being Generation X and millennials, and that can fall into, I guess, one category, essentially people under 50 years old. Baby boomers are people generally nearing retirement or in early retirement, and then pre-baby boomers, or people who have likely settled into retirement and are, say, over 70 or so. So these are groups that are going to have many common planning considerations, but every individual situation is going to be different. So it's always important to think about as you're thinking through estate planning. Just have to always follow sort of the general basics. It's going to be different for everyone, so that's important to keep in mind. And it's worth noting that a lot of these groups likely prioritize or value certain planning strategies differently. So one group might often find gifting to be appealing or an appealing strategy as part of a plan, while another generation might not. So that's just another factor that can go into the planning discussion. So let's start with estate planning early. So this is the Generation X and millennials. Let's see here. It's easy. I guess I would say it's easy to delay estate planning in this stage. I fall in the Gen X category. It's easy for us to think, I guess, that we're going to maybe live forever in a sense, or it's just we're busy building careers and juggling family life and so forth. So the focus is on saving and accumulating assets in retirement accounts, business values, and real estate. So it's easy to put estate planning on the back burner at this stage. We're often considered the sandwich generation too, in that we have, perhaps, or at least moving into that, where we're a generation below. We're taking care of a generation below us. We're caring for them as our children, and then also perhaps starting to do the same for the generation above us. So, some of the things that I think are common planning considerations for this group when it comes to estate planning is, there's a mention at the top there. There's fewer liquid assets, but you're in the process of accumulating wealth. So that's with all the retirement, putting money away in the retirement accounts, and you're building businesses. You have houses that may be appreciating in value, and so that's really kind of the primary focus. But there's also what Veronica you had mentioned, which is the guardianship of a will and naming guardians in a will is so important. So at this stage, you're likely to have minor children, and so it's important to name guardians in your will. I mean, that's probably the most one of the most important things that you can do as far as making sure that you're putting your affairs in order. But a good tip there is let the person know that let the person you're naming as a guardian know that they're the guardian in your will, to not totally surprise them if the unforeseen happens. But that's a really important thing. And also having life insurance is, well, some people may not think of that necessarily as estate planning. It really just from a planning standpoint, having life insurance at this stage is extremely important. And it's really a way to replace important income, and that you'll be earning over that time period. And that's there for paying large expenses, covering college costs, really putting your family in a good financial situation if something happens to the person in the family who may be the higher earner, and the one really from a financial standpoint is sort of driving that savings. So that's an important part. And then coordinate and review beneficiary designations. This is the sort of time when people may early on set some, they start saving in a retirement plan for work, and they just name a beneficiary because you sort of have to, as you kind of set things up, and you may not realize that you've never gone back and actually put your family in and your spouse as a beneficiary, and how to account for your children there as well. So that's just, again, even though it's early, it's extremely important. If something does happen, it could really create a problem if somebody passes away. And then protecting assets, if there are minors, making sure that you're not just, if something happens, assets are not going directly to minor children, that you'd want to maintain those assets and keep those assets in a trust or some form of protection, so that those assets are in good order for your children when they do reach an older age and they are adults, that money has been taken care of. And then I think just having also flexibility, because over time, these areas are going to change, and as you continue to build wealth and grow, make sure that you have some flexibility in your plan, and just understand that you'll be going back to that regularly at this stage as things change over time, and it's important, and as potentially tax laws change, you'll want to make sure that you have flexibility in there to make necessary adjustments.
Yeah, and on the beneficiary designation point, it's important to name both primary and contingent. And, as Dana said, if there are assets in a trust for children, you don't want minors to inherit, especially, as people's retirement accounts grow over time. You don't want minors to inherit those assets outright. And if they do, a lot of times the court will be involved until they are of a majority age. So you want to make sure to provide for those trusts and to name your beneficiaries as you want them. I think that's real important in this stage.
Right. Very good. So we'll move on now to baby boomers. So generally people between 50 and 70, I would say. This is the time period where a lot of planning picks up. There's a shift from that accumulation mindset that I was talking about with the Generation X or millennial generations, where it's saving and sort of accumulating wealth, and that's the focus. Well, now there's that change and transitioning into one where you really have to set strategies for living off of your assets and meeting needs throughout retirement. And so it's more of a kind of accumulation phase moving into a utilizing phase. And so that could be, a bit of a challenge, but there's also a lot of planning that goes into that, and across the board, and estate planning certainly isn't left out of that whole process. So, I think just touching again on some very and some similar concepts to what we covered before with Generation X or millennials. But, I think if you're recently retired in this stage, as I just mentioned, it's kind of rethinking how you're shifting from that from the accumulation to the utilization or spend down phase. At this stage, you may have higher liquid assets. You've built up those. You built up the retirement plan. You've done additional savings. So now your assets are maybe set up in a way to where there just are more liquid assets. There's just more wealth relative to maybe some of the non-liquid assets, like a house or some other assets you may have. So again, it's just things have changed, and so there's some different considerations that you have to make sure you're planning for. And so, I think revisiting some of the things that we just covered, one being reviewing beneficiary designations at this stage is extremely important. Again, you've spent the time building up this wealth, and so making sure that as part of your overall plan, some of the things that Veronica you had touched on with just making sure things are coordinated. This is another time where it's really important as you're phasing into retirement, reviewing those beneficiary designations, making sure that that's in line with your overall plan is key, because this may be a time when you're moving retirement plans out and into qualified plans out and into IRAs, and so that's like a fresh time to really evaluate all of this and make sure that things are coordinated there. Again, reevaluating insurance needs. This is at one point earlier when you were building your wealth, you had younger children, you would have used insurance as a way to make sure that you replace income if something happens. At this particular stage, the needs for insurance may have changed. You may not have to replace income necessarily in retirement, but there may be other needs. Maybe you can shift maybe it's to set aside into a trust. You mentioned an irrevocable life insurance trust, Veronica. That's an opportunity where you may move that something into a trust to replace assets that may be used for estate taxes, or to perhaps just maybe you can change a policy into something that covers some long-term care needs. And so those are some things that you just would be potentially reevaluating insurance needs. Making sure that you're reevaluating how assets are distributed to family members. Should trust be a bigger part of that, instead of maybe before the plan was a little bit more simplistic in some ways. Now what perhaps how family members are how comfortable they are with their money, and what place they are financially as well. And so you can make some decisions there based on if maybe they have some difficulty financially. You can make sure that you set up their share or what will be passing on accordingly to account for some of those, just to account for some of those considerations depending on how family members are doing. And so this is another time to sort of reevaluate that process and think about how to care for certain family members and be more specific, because more about how their own lives are going. And then I think business owners making sure that there's a succession plan in place as you move into retirement, having a plan set so that when you are ready to retire and sell a business, it's not you're not really just trying to make a quick decision about what to do. You want to make sure that you have a real clear plan in place, either passing asset, maybe moving the asset or moving the business to family members, or selling it to another party. Those things are all really important to have in place as you move into retirement. It makes the process a lot easier. College funding for children or grandchildren is going to be a big part here. I mean, college funding for children certainly would happen a little sooner, most likely, but I think at this stage there'd be a lot of effort on making sure that if there are children in college age, that doing the things you need to do to assist there, but also planning ahead for grandchildren. If you have the means to do that, that's a good time to put money into perhaps 529 plans and really allow that to grow tax-free over time. So, this is a good time to focus on that. And then charitable interests here may start to be a higher priority. If you have a fair amount of wealth, then charitable giving can help a cause that's really important and dear to your heart, but then also build that into some of the tax planning and some of the ways to potentially reduce a taxable estate. And so the last point there on the screen, where it's just tax planning in general, can become a much bigger importance, and related to what I touched on earlier, which was as proposals that we're hearing about, if some of those things come to pass, where some of the exemptions, I mean, certainly where things stand now, or at least in 2025, we'd be reverting back to a slightly, a lower, I mean, not slightly, but a meaningfully lower estate tax exemption. But even so, there's discussions about that being even lower than just reverting back to those levels. So more people may be impacted. So this is something where tax planning at this stage of retirement, when you've amassed your wealth, then it becomes that much more important.
Yeah, and I think too, thinking about in this stage, thinking about your children are probably grown or, adults or close to it at this stage in life. So, thinking about what type of assets to pass, if you want to pass different assets to different children. So, for example, if you have a very, very successful child, you might not want to give them the IRA assets. You might want to give them, taxable assets, because the IRA assets are fully taxable to them and to their already, nice income, and may shoot them into a higher tax bracket. So I think also thinking about the assets you're leaving, who you're leaving them to, and how it affects them is also something important to think about in this stage of life too.
Right. Very good. And we'll move on to then our third group here, pre-baby boomers, so roughly 70 or older. This is when a lot of people might think you start estate planning, which is obviously not the case, as we've been touching on. But it's a time where I think it's people are older, and you think this is the time to make sure that your affairs are in order. But there's there are some things here that are unique, that from a planning standpoint and from our experiences are really things that are common considerations and important things to to keep in mind. And so for people in this generation, financially maybe more set, that you may not be as concerned about running out of money. So it's that the focus can be less on sort of that traditional maybe retirement planning, cash flow modeling that people focus on, as they're building their wealth and in retirement. Now it's the models that you put together and some of those tools play a bigger role on sort of understanding the entire estate planning and the estate tax process. So kind of providing insight on how much maybe can be gifted. Is there, if it's going to be an estate tax concern, what can you do to, how capable are you to maybe shift some money out of your estate, still have enough to meet your own needs or, your family's needs, but then address some other goals that you may have that would allow you to shift some money out of the estate. So this is where gifting can become a much higher priority. And I think one thing that Veronica, I think, you and I both, working with enough clients where kind of the traditional idea of, hey, you just pass everything on when you pass away to your family, gifting can be, and currently estate tax laws and gift tax laws allow for this, and much more and provide much more flexibility. But it's just, allowing or seeing your family utilizing a gift can, I think, be much more satisfying and enjoyable than just setting up a plan and just, when you pass away, those assets are distributed and you sort of, just take peace in knowing that they're taken care of. But maybe actually seeing them utilize some of the gifts I think can be really valuable. And so I think that's something where there's much more gifts to family members to shift some money out of a taxable estate, making gifts into trust, perhaps touching on what we covered before, which is, and what you touched on as well, Veronica, about depending on family situations, continuing to maybe make additional gifts. If some trusts were set up at some point, making more gifts into those trusts, those assets can be protected and used according to your wishes, based on how you'd like your assets to be passed along. Again, helping with college funding, another with grandchildren again, and shifting some of those assets potentially into college savings vehicles, or even just making one of the simple gifting strategies can be writing checks to the institutions. That's something where it doesn't always have to be in a savings vehicle like a 529 plan. If you're older and you just want to help out your grandchildren with some college funding, you can just make it as simple as just writing that check to help out to the institution, and it's not actually considered a gift. It's because it's directed right to the institution. And like I said before, with charitable giving, it can become a higher priority, building, important causes into your plan, making gifts either, outright during your lifetime, or building something into a plan where when you pass away, assets can be distributed to a charity, as a bequest, or perhaps even as a beneficiary of a retirement plan. So those are all things that can be reevaluated as you're in this stage and thinking about estate planning, kind of in the later stages. Uh, but so I think just ensuring the strategies are in place to protect assets for certain beneficiaries. I mean, that's a key here. There's likely a new generation of family members, grandchildren, who are becoming adults at this stage, and that can mean there's an extra layer of planning now as well. But it might be a good time to also simplify or streamline your estate plan. So whereas maybe in the baby boomer generation, there would be much more complexity because kind of all these other things are coming together with children getting older, and then a growing family, understanding how to kind of organize your wealth. There can be some complexity. It may actually be a good time when you're much older to simplify things as kind of a final stages of estate planning, because you've realized that many things have been taken care of. People are in really doing well financially, and so you can keep things much more simplistic, maybe more than you had initially thought. And then finally here, I'll just add is just tax planning is going to be a key part of this. This is where really would be an opportunity to evaluate how things look from a tax standpoint, as it applies to the estate. And so making some final tax planning decisions is certainly going to be a key part of this.
Yeah, and I think too at this stage too, I see a lot of people reevaluating trustees and executors. If they did their wills when their children were young, they might have older wills that, named their sibling, the grandparent at this point, the older generation sibling as a trustee or an executor, and naming the children or naming even grandchildren in roles. So I think that it's a good time to reevaluate those appointments, because you may have done them initially at a time when everybody was much younger, and so taking a second look at that usually helps, because you don't want to mess, again, to Dana's initial point when we started talking about this. You want to leave everything kind of buttoned up for the next generation.
Right. And so I guess just to conclude here, some real high level, I think, good points to take away. It's as you're working through all of this, really work with an attorney to implement an estate plan, and that's really important, right? Work with a professional that knows this area and can provide guidance, and really probably would be addressing many of the things that Veronica and I just covered, and thinking about sort of different stages that you may be in, and where you see yourself going forward. Can have some really good conversations there, and Veronica could certainly speak to that. She worked as an estate planning attorney for a number of years. So, and also work with an advisor to monitor the plan and build the estate planning into the overall plan, and review that on an ongoing basis. It really needs to be. Hopefully we've outlined and you've seen the importance of how a lot of areas of financial planning can sort of intersect with estate planning and be such a key part of the overall process. So just that's a key point here. And then I think an important takeaway is just make adjustments, review the plan regularly, and amend it when goals change, family situations change, and your assets change over time. There's legislative changes, as we've touched on. So all those things, every, say, 2 to 5 years, is probably a good gauge for. It's going to be different for some people, but reviewing it regularly is important. I think it's just a key takeaway. Let me see here, and that's about it. I think it wraps up the material we wanted to cover. Really just scratching the surface, as you can tell from an estate planning standpoint. I think there's a lot more we could get into with some more sophisticated vehicles to help, but I think this gives you a good overview on estate planning. And if you're interested in learning more, Manning & Napier has an estate planning guidebook that covers this topic. You can download that at the link on the screen there. Also, you can subscribe to receive content from Manning & Napier that we create, covering a broad range of planning and investment related topics. So we produce a fair amount of material that addresses timely planning topics, and also investment related topics you may find interesting and helpful, such as what we covered on this video. So thanks, Veronica, for joining me on the presentation. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And on behalf of Manning & Napier, thank you very much, and take care.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.